no surprise to you that when I accepted this position 5 years ago, the first thing someone gave me was the book City of Light. And I remember vividly the opening scene where she's standing there and says, "I'm not what I appear." And I think for any head of school, there is an aspect of that, in that you appear in these formal public ways, and yet you also have a very personal life aside from that. It is such a privilege to be head of this wonderful school at this particular time in its history, and I'm so happy to have all of you here tonight to welcome Laura Belfer back to SEM. It's my privilege to introduce Henry McCartney, who will introduce our speaker. He is Executive Director of Preservation Buffalo Niagara. So please welcome Henry McCartney.
Seminary for hosting this. I want to welcome you tonight for several reasons. One, this is, in my opinion, the end event for the National Preservation Conference. And it's been my pleasure to be one of the organizers of that. And truly, I think all of Buffalo needs to be very proud of it. We've all kind of gone nuts about bringing the National Preservation Conference here. Are any conference graduates from out of town still with us? Thank you for coming. I hope you're good. I also want to thank some of you, probably most of you, took the bus tour we had. We've been doing that for several years with Laura's approval of our route and how we do that. This is the first time you joined us after one of our bus trips. I was very excited when a mutual friend emailed me and said that you might be coming to Buffalo as part of the conference and we could arrange that. And so, to me, it is great to have you as kind of a bookend of our National Preservation Conference. I also, if any of you are not members of Preservation Buffalo Niagara, we would like to give you some of your feedback for coming here. So, typically, our memberships are $40 for individual and $50 for family. We'll cut that in half for coming here tonight. In addition, I wanted to come back to the conference a little bit. I don't know if you remember, but I Googled a little bit about you and got an interview. The interview is nothing directly with you, but the interviewer said, "Why did you choose to set a city alight in Buffalo, a place most of us think is downtrodden and depressed?" Do you remember that? And of course, you were from Buffalo. Kind of rude interviewer. But that's exactly, I think that image of Buffalo, our desire for this conference to put that to rest. And I think we have, those of you from elsewhere, we're not going to take that image back to the rest of the world. There were 2,500 people, probably 22 were from other states and places of New York. And so the conference is doing that. As important as the conference, I think, got us that live here to realize how important our architecture and heritage is. And so that depressed and downtrodden won't come from anybody from Buffalo. I can't believe that. I also want to make you, those of you that are here, honorary members of the 19th Ward Book Club. We're having we're in our 25th or 26th year. It's from Rochester, New York, which actually, I didn't know till tonight, is where Lauren was born. I do have members of the book club. What are we on, our 250th book or something? But the members of the 19th book club, the real members, stand up. We brought in a social historian. Mary Beth, would you stand up? Enjoyed the book very much. Most of all, though, we are here this week. However, it was the second time I read your book, so I do remember the whole book. But it is wonderful as a person from Buffalo to kind of read that social history of our town, and to, but of course this book has gone around the world, so you don't have to live here to appreciate it, though I certainly think those of us that do live here get an extra value out of the people and places that we're reading. I certainly, and I will plug your own book if you're not going to. You can be able to sell your second book afterwards. I didn't get back in time. But anyway, fierce reliance. Well, I want to thank you for coming. I want everybody to join you. And thanks again for being part of our National Federation.
First of all, I want to thank Henry. Not many people realize what a pivotal role he's played in the preservation movement in Buffalo and in bringing the convention here, which has been so extraordinary for this city. So Henry, thank you very much for all of that. Fred is back there. And Jennifer Walkowski and Denise Prince, who wrote the tour, which I think is fantastic. They're architectural historians. And they're up here, aren't they? Yes, there they are. I look out and I see many old friends here. I want to point out Vivian Green of the 20th Century Club, who helped me with my research, invited me into the 20th Century Club, that great resource for learning about Buffalo and the lives of women in 1900. Thank you so much, Vivian, for coming. And of course, I want to thank the staff of the Buffalo Seminary, Gwen Ito, who worked so hard to bring me here, and Jody, thank you for the introduction. You know, the school looks fantastic. And the two of my favorite teachers are here, Harry Schooley and Gary Sutton. So they helped to shape And some of my close family members are here. My mom is here, Nancy Belfer. Two aunts, Leona Barback and Kiyum Barback. My aunts are here. Last but not least, I need to thank my technical advisor, Michael Morrison. Tonight we're doing a PowerPoint presentation, which I've never done before. It's very exciting, and Michael basically helped me to put it together. I picked the pictures. I'm very glad he could be here to do that for me. And I do want to thank Beth, who's the seminary's technical advisor, for doing such a great job. Okay, so this week we've come together in Buffalo to celebrate our extraordinary architecture. But I started thinking about, what this architecture means to us as citizens of Buffalo, as people who've grown up here. To a certain extent, I think we take it for granted. We live with these buildings every day, and yet they must have some, if only some kind of subliminal influence on us every day. And I know that the buildings must have been playing in the back of my mind as I came to write City of Light, as I keyed into all that was in my mind from my memories of my girlhood. So, just take this. So So my first memory of Buffalo architecture is the towers of the Richardson, of what we used to call the asylum when I was a girl. Now, when I was at a young pivotal age, we lived on Richmond Avenue near Forest, and I looked down at the asylum every day. And my friends and I used to terrify one another with stories about how there was someone in the tower watching us, and if we misbehaved, he would come and get us. And we thought that he had a telescope, and he aimed it right down Richmond Avenue and watched us. And you know, it was decades later that I learned that, in fact, those towers are completely deserted. No one has ever lived there or worked there. They're just for show. And I must say that was very disappointing to me. Then the second thing I remember about Buffalo's past is the Central Terminal. Now, I remember going to the terminal when I was a girl to take trains to New York City, to take trains to Chicago. I don't know how many of you remember the feeling of walking into the Central Terminal. You felt like you were a god or a goddess. It was such an extraordinary, glorious place, and it used to have a gigantic bison in the lobby here. Does anyone remember the gigantic bison? I was at the terminal in the summer for an event they were having, and the bison is not there any longer, unfortunately. But I think the idea that we could bring this building back is something that we should all try to unite to do. It was one of the great landmarks in railroad terminal construction in America, and meant so much to the people of this city. Another great memory of my childhood was the Butler House. Now, in this picture, it looks beautiful, doesn't it? It's been completely renovated, of course. But when I was a child, it was all boarded up. You know, every window was boarded up. The trees were a wreck. You barely look in the gates. And the rumor was that an old woman lived there, and that she was growing older every day, of course, alone there in that home. Again, very terrifying. We didn't really know who she was, what she was doing there, just that she lived all alone. And then one of the saddest memories of my childhood, Humboldt Parkway. You know, I still get a little choked up when I see this. Again, I don't know how many of you remember Humboldt Parkway. Built by Frederick Law Olmsted when the City Fathers brought him here to design Buffalo, and he called Buffalo the best designed city in America. And that was saying a lot, because he himself had designed many of the cities in America, and he felt that Buffalo was his great masterpiece. And we all know what happened to Humboldt Parkway. What was that? That's right. It's now an expressway. More about that later. So these were the memories of my early childhood. And when I got a little older, the Ellicott Square building began to play a role in my life, because that was where the Department of Motor Vehicles was located. And so I went there to get my learner's permit, and again at various moments in my quest to have a driver's license. And I remember going in for the first time and thinking, wow, this is amazing. And then thinking, you know, the equivalent of my girlhood of the teenage, oh, whatever, as I went up the stairs to the Department of Motor Vehicles. And I really didn't think much about the Ellicott Square building again. I'm sorry to say that that reaction of not really thinking about it very much was common in my childhood. When I was growing up in Buffalo, really the city was essentially dying. The industries were leaving, unemployment was high, the inner city was breaking down. My friends and I spent hours and hours talking about how and when we would escape from Buffalo. We weren't raised to take pride in the city or to look back to the city's history for inspiration. I didn't even know until literally decades later that that old woman growing old in the Butler house was Kate Robinson Butler, who was still called the publisher of the Buffalo News. She was one of the most extraordinary women in the city's history. And there she was in a boarded-up building that most people thought of as a haunted house. That to me kind of symbolizes what had become of the city and of people's recognition of what the city was. So, you know, the years passed. I graduated from the Buffalo Seminary. I went to college. And like almost all of my friends, I left Buffalo and rarely came back. It's one of the great sadnesses of my life that so many exciting things have happened with City of Light, and none of my close friends from my childhood are here to share them. We're all around the country. It's a sad thing for me to think about. At any rate, one day about 15 years ago now, I made an astonishing discovery about Buffalo. I was in town visiting my parents. My son was little then, he was about 4, and I left him with his grandparents, and I went for a walk. And I stopped here at the Buffalo Historical Museum, and this picture is of the Historical Museum in 1901, and a postcard from 1901. The exhibit going on at the Historical Society was about Buffalo in 1901. It was about the Pan American Exposition. It was about the development of hydroelectric power in Niagara Falls. What I learned in the next few hours that I spent at this exhibit absolutely amazed me. 100 years ago, Buffalo was a place of immense wealth, political influence, and technological innovation. Buffalo's harbor was the greatest inland port in America, the commercial gateway between East and West. It was a railroad hub. Its stockyards were second to none, and it was the flour capital of the world. And here are 2 of the gigantic grain elevators that used to line the Buffalo River. Hydroelectric power was being developed nearby in Niagara Falls, and it was the wealth of Buffalo that was paying for the development of the hydroelectric power in Niagara Falls. There was so much technological innovation going on at the falls. All of it stemming from Buffalo and benefiting the families of Buffalo. So essentially, Buffalo had become the Silicon Valley of its day. And with all the wealth and technological innovation, the greatest architects in the country came to Buffalo to work. And starting in around the 1870s, we began to get these extraordinary buildings. So this is the old City Hall, and then, you know, we got Louis Sullivan came here and built the Guarantee Building. And not just these incredible commercial buildings, but also extraordinary houses. So we had, you know, these are just 2 examples of some of the mansions that were built in Buffalo in the 1890s. In 1901, Buffalo had 60 millionaires. Now, to be a millionaire in 1901, that was really something. Perhaps not so impressive today. But in those days, I mean, Buffalo was right up there with New York City, with Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston. It was one of the very great cities of America. Because of its achievements, Buffalo received the honor of being chosen to host a World's Fair. So the Pan American Exposition took place here in Buffalo, and here's a picture of the entryway to the Pan Am. One of the beautiful fountains, the Pan Am. And then the poster for the Pan Am. You know, this city that I discovered, the exhibit at the Historical Society, was a place that I had never caught a glimmer of during my childhood. And I was really kind of staggered by everything that I learned. So after I toured the exhibit, I went for a walk in Delaware Park. Here's a picture of the park in 1901 when my book takes place, and you can see essentially the people who become the characters in my book, walking to the band shell and the casino in the distance. So after I saw the exhibit, as I say, I went for a walk in the park. And I sat down at the shores of the park lake. Now, at this time in my life, I've been struggling to find a topic for a novel. I had decided when I was 6 years old that I wanted to become a fiction writer. I don't know why I made that decision. There I was living on Richmond Avenue looking at the asylum every day, and maybe that had something to do with it. When I got to the SAM, I was writing poetry, and my wonderful English teachers here at SAM encouraged me to send my poetry out to magazines around the country. I collected rejection letters from all the best places around the country. Then I went to college, and I was still writing. By that time, I was writing short stories and getting up early in the morning to work on novels before going to my office job, because of course I had to earn a living. I worked a lot of odd jobs on my road to becoming a writer. I like to tell people, especially when I'm in a school, that the first short story I ever had published was rejected 42 times before it found an editor who loved it, and actually quite a prestigious literary journal. The second short story I published was a much quicker success. It was only rejected 27 times before it found an editor who loved it. Now, let's face it, even 10 rejections of one short story is a lot of rejections. But there was something about my approach to this, a sort of doggedness, and I like to think it was because of growing up in Buffalo and of attending the Buffalo Seminary. I just didn't give up. You know, and I think people in Buffalo tend not to give up either. You just keep fighting until something good happens. And, you know, eventually, maybe 42 rejections, but then something good does happen. So that taught me a lesson. At any rate, for many months I've been trying to find a topic for a novel. I wanted to write a novel which would show individual lives playing out against the course of history. But I just hadn't been able to find a suitable topic that I could really bring to fruition. You know, it's not just enough with a novel to have a great first chapter or a great second chapter. You have to have an entire arc and follow people as their lives develop over time. And I hadn't been able to do that. But at any rate, that day, there I was. I sat down on the shores of the lake. Now, at this time, it was about 15 years ago, as I say, what we now call Hoyt Lake had been transformed from what I remembered as a girl. When I was a girl, this lake was a disaster. It was filled with abandoned cars and garbage. It was covered with grease. It was a dangerous place to sit by. And after a long period of urban renewal, it had been transformed into a place of beauty. And I thought, oh, it's as beautiful as it must have been in 1901 when this picture was done. And then all at once, in a kind of moment of insight, I knew the novel that I had to write. I knew that I had to write a novel about my city and about the glories of its past, set against the kind of ruin of the city that I had grown up with. I felt I had almost a responsibility to tell my city's story. Because in those days, wherever you went in America, if you said you were from Buffalo, people said horrible things. They made horrible jokes. And here I had just learned that that really wasn't Buffalo at all. The people had a completely incorrect idea of what our city was. And I felt a kind of duty to the city to write a book that would explain what the city had once been and really what it still was, despite all the horrible jokes that people would make about it. Now, right away, after I had this moment of insight, there was like a door opening in my mind, and I felt I was walking through it. But right away, after I got through, of course, the demons came. Now, all fiction writers will tell you that they're very familiar with the demons, but as soon as you get an idea, the demons are there, saying, "Oh, you are so stupid. Don't be ridiculous. You could never write a book about Buffalo. How would you ever write a book about Buffalo? How would you center the story? How would you find a way to narrate that story?" Well, I realized that just up the street from where I was sitting in Delaware Park, was the Buffalo Seminary. This is a picture of Sem when it was just built in, I think, 1906. And I'd always heard stories at Sem about the marvelous women who'd been the headmistresses of the school in its early years, that these were really strong, vibrant women who played a role in Buffalo society. And I thought to myself, a woman like that, could really wield power in the city and really give me entree into every part of the city. And that someone like that would be the ideal person to narrate the kind of novel I had in mind that would bring in all the different parts of the city. Well, then right away the demons returned and said, "Don't be ridiculous. Who'd want to spend 500 pages with, an old-fashioned headmistress? Who could be as boring as a headmistress?" And it was thinking about what the demons said to me that I thought, no, the headmistress who was going to narrate my book would only appear on the surface to be one of those stereotypical headmistresses. She'd only appear on the surface to be a blue stocking. In reality, she would have a life far different from what people might assume from the job that she did, and that her past would be hidden, and that much of her energy would be taken up by all she had to conceal and protect about her life. Well, the next day, my son and I returned to New York City, and I began to research the novel and plan it out in my mind. Immediately I learned, again, how important Buffalo was in 1901, because the libraries of New York City were bursting with information about Buffalo. This in itself shocked me, because I was so accustomed, again, to Buffalo being the butt of jokes everywhere I went. But instead, the libraries in New York City were filled with 19th century guidebooks, with newspaper clippings about events in the city, collections of photographs of the sights of the city, of the houses of the city parks, everything I could possibly want. One thing that they also had, which was very helpful to me, were photos of the great Buffalonians. Again, who would ever expect? So that way I found photos. Here we have Ainsley Wilcox. If you were on the bus tour today, you went to his home, which is where Teddy Roosevelt was sworn in as president. Mariah Love, who is known still, I think, for the balls named in her honor. But she led the charities of the city, was a very wealthy woman, and I always think, she could have been president of the United States if they allowed women to vote in her day. Really formidable person. Dexter Rumsey here, who becomes one of the lead characters in the novel, and to my way of thinking, the mastermind of everything that went on in Buffalo. This is John Albright, the Albright Knox Art Gallery, and the pivotal person in bringing Bethlehem steel to Buffalo. And in fact, he made 25 cents on every train car of coal that went through Buffalo. He personally made 25 cents on it, and because hundreds of thousands of train cars of coal went through Buffalo every year, he was a very wealthy man. And here we have Grover Cleveland. Well, we know his story: sheriff, mayor, governor, president of the United States. He married his ward, that's Frances Folsom Cleveland. He was 49 years old, she was 22 when they got married. He had pushed her wheelchair, pushed her perambulator when she was a baby around Buffalo. And when she grew up, he married her. Early on, as I researched the novel, I knew that I wanted to blend real people like these, whose pictures you've just seen, with fictional characters. I felt that only by using real people could I pay tribute to the greatness of the city. And then only by using fictional people could I develop the story in whatever way I wanted it to go. So this is how I landed on the technique of blending real people with my own fictional characters. And then all the people that I was conjuring up in my imagination, I put into the beautiful office buildings and the beautiful homes of the city. I had them walking up and down our beautiful parkways and streets, until gradually I felt that the city itself became a character in the novel. And the more I read about the city, the more I could conjure up in my own mind its past. And so here's a parking lot, for example, at Canisius High School. In 1901, this parking lot was this beautiful mansion. This is the Milburn Estate. This is where President McKinley died. And John Milburn was a lawyer, and he was the president of the Pan American Exposition. He was the man who brought the Pan Am here. The Pan Am, by the way, was such a financial failure that he was run out of town after the Pan Am closed. He went to New York. This superhighway, some of you may recognize this. The Kensington Expressway, there's the Science Museum in the background, and the homes of Humboldt Parkway. So as I did my research for the book, I came to be able to look at this and project myself back to what it had once been like, Humboldt Parkway, and recreate that in my mind, try to imagine what the city was like for the people who lived in those days. As I did more and more research here in Buffalo, I discovered surprising clues to the city's past right on our streets every day. So this is on West Ferry. I'm sure all of you have driven by this a million times without realizing that this is the original gate into the Albright Estate. And this red wall, which goes all along West Ferry between Elmwood and Delaware, is the original wall that once surrounded the Albright Estate. Now there are many houses back there now. It goes all the way to Cleveland in the back, so you can see the back wall and the exit and the gate and the exit. Originally there was one house there, John Albright's house. So he owned a vast swath of land right in the middle of the city. And I used to walk back and forth and try to feel, to conjure up in my mind what it must have felt like for people walking there, to look in and see the home of this fabulously wealthy man and this great philanthropist. I also discovered the botanical gardens. Again, I'd grown up in Buffalo. I never visited the botanical gardens. So one day my mom and I and my little son, we drove out to South Park and visited the botanical gardens. You know, they were like 10 minutes from downtown. We couldn't believe how close it was, in a beautiful park designed by Olmsted. Again, I grew up here. I never knew that Olmsted designed a park there. So I made that into a scene in the novel. One of the last scenes of the novel has Louisa Barrett walking with her friend Mary Talbert in the botanical gardens. And then I also discovered the Coatsworth House on Cottage Street. And some of you have probably heard me say before that I was driving round and round those little streets around Cottage Street. They're all one way. It's very hard to make your way around. And then suddenly I turned a corner, and amid all these little workers' cottages rose up this Second Empire mansion. And I happened to drive by it a day when there was a moving truck outside. And I pulled over, and my little son said, "No, Mom, I'm not going in that house with you. I'm just not going in there with you." And, you know, my son, it's always been the case to be very counterintuitive with him. Just said, "Okay, honey, suit yourself." And I pulled over and I got out of the car, and well, naturally he followed. He did not stay in the car alone, nor would I have let him stay in the car alone. But I knew that he would willingly follow once I just went ahead and did it. Anyway, we were naturally invited up to see the apartment that this young lady was moving into, the top floor there, with an incredible view of the Niagara River. And so I included that. You know, there's a scene there where Louisa Barrett meets with her friend, Francesca Coatsworth, the top floor of that house. So bit by bit, as you see, the city began to come alive for me. Here's a postcard of the old city and the skyline there. I began to feel that the novel City of Light really was the story of two cities. Yes, it was the story of the glorious city of 1901, but it was also the story of the city that I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s. The city I grew up in is never mentioned in City of Light, of course, but I almost feel that it hovers there in the background, that the novel City of Light is a direct reflection of the city that I knew when I grew up. Maybe direct reflection is the wrong word. It's a kind of flipping of the city that I grew up in. And that Louisa Barrett goes out of her way in the novel to describe this wonderful city that she's found herself in and all the things she loves about it. Well, one of the things that motivates her to do that is that I'm remembering the city that I grew up in. And the city that she lives in is so different. And so, to me, there was a playing off of those two cities, back and forth, back and forth. Even the title of the novel seems to symbolize for me this kind of counterpoint. Maybe counterpoint is the best word for it, between the city of 1901 and the city that I grew up in. In 1901, everyone called Buffalo the City of Light because of the electricity that came from Niagara Falls, because of the Pan-American Exposition, which was also called the City of Light. Well, the idea in the 1960s and 1970s that Buffalo might be a city of light, I mean, anyone around the country would have said that was laughable. But interestingly enough, Buffalo now again is being called the City of Light. And that makes me so happy. I mean, a lot of the publicity materials for the conference this week have called it the City of Light. Again, it's not Paris. It was never Paris. It was always Buffalo. So there's nothing new, and it makes me so happy to see a kind of going back to that. I knew when I began to write the novel that I wanted to capture from the very first pages of the book my feelings about the city. So now I'm just going to read to you a few pages from the beginning of the novel, and I think you'll see how everything I've been saying about what I want to do, what I wanted to do in the book, plays out right in the first few pages of it. So this is chapter 1. On the first Monday in March, 1901, in the early evening when the sound of sleigh bells filled the air, a student unexpectedly knocked at my door. I was accustomed to receiving visitors on Mondays before dinner, when my drawing room was transformed into a salon. Bankers and industrialists would stop by my comfortable stone house attached to the Macaulay School, and they knew they would find professors and artists, editors, architects, and writers gathered there. In those days, Buffalo was flush in an era of extraordinary economic prosperity and civic optimism. The city had become the most important inland port in America because of its pivotal location at the eastern end of the Great Lakes. Indeed, at the turn of our century, Buffalo had taken its place among the great cities of the United States. Many visitors to my salon were from New York City or Chicago, men who came to Buffalo at the behest of our public-spirited business leaders to offer their best work to the city. These included architects like Louis Sullivan and Stanford White, the sculptors Augustus Saint-Gaudin and Daniel Chester French. Years ago, I met the architect Daniel Burnham, and he invited himself for sharing, and he came again on his next visit to Buffalo. Soon all the great men came, presenting their cards with a note at the suggestion of our mutual friend, and then the local people of distinction, with family names such as Rumsey, Albright, and Scatcherd, began calling too. They could only do this because I was considered unmarriageable, because I was a kind of wise virgin, an Athena, if you will. These men granted me my freedom, and I granted them theirs. Of course, there were other women at my salon, doctors, architects, artists. Those who had husbands came with them, and those who did not came alone, or with the other women who were their life companions. I like to think that my Monday evening salon was the only place in the city where men and women could mingle as equals. In the past 2 years, the stream of visitors to my salon had become ever more fascinating, and their concerns ever more urgent as they planned the design and construction of a World's Fair called the Pan American Exposition. Yes, Buffalo was to be an exposition city now, in the tradition of Chicago and Philadelphia. The exposition site was less than a mile from my home, and over 8 million people from around the country and the world were expected to visit the fair during the coming summer. Debates about lighting, coloring, and schematic statuary took place over my fire, the gentlemen tapping their pipes against the mantel. But on this particular Monday evening in March, I sent my visitors away by 7. There was a wet snow falling and a chill dampness in the air that made me want to sit alone in front of my fireplace. My guests grumbled half-heartedly at leaving early, though some of them were privately grateful, no doubt, to return home. Here on the shores of Lake Erie, we respected the icy storms of early spring. And although they might not admit it, more than a few of my out-of-town visitors probably yearned to leave business behind and move on to a relaxing game of whist in the mahogany-paneled confines of the all-male Buffalo Club. After they were gone, I sat in my rocking chair, resting my head, luxuriating in the evening. And then in the quiet, I heard my favorite sound, sleigh bells jingling on harnesses as the horses trotted down Bidwell Parkway, sleigh guiders swishing through the snow. At this hour, bejeweled couples cloaked in fur against the cold were on their way to dinner parties. Snowstorms were never permitted to interfere with the social swirl. Closing my eyes, I conjured a scene in my mind. A dining room with French doors and a coffered ceiling, a long table laid for 12, freshly polished silver, candlelight throwing rainbows through the crystal. I was apart from that life, observing it, never living it. Nonetheless, I pictured myself reclining on a sleigh, the harness bells dancing, a bison skin pulled around me for warmth as snowflakes touched my face, and I was carried to dinner at the estate of John J. Albright or Dexter P. Rumsey. You know, City of Light was published in 1999, 12 years ago now. And I have to tell you that in the past decade or so, I've noticed something remarkable happening in Buffalo. The city has changed, and it is changing every day. To me, the spirit of Buffalo is now much closer to the spirit of 1901 than it ever was to the bleak and blighted city that I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. You just have to walk along Elwood Avenue or on Allen Street on a weekend afternoon, visit the city in July during the garden walk, go to a concert at Kleinhans Music Hall, art exhibit at the Albright Knox or the Birchfield Penny. There's such an excitement and passion in this city today. It's utterly remarkable. And so far removed, as I have said, from the city I grew up in and the city that helped to shape my novel. So I can only conclude tonight by saying that, in my opinion, Buffalo has become the City of Light once again. Thank you all very much for being here. Character in the book, and if I modeled him on anyone, I did not model him on anyone in particular. Certainly not on anyone in Buffalo. I wanted him to be an outsider coming into Buffalo and working with the established families in Buffalo. As part of my research, I did a lot of reading about what America was like around the turn of the century, and about how hydropower was developed and the kind of people who managed these hydropower stations. And I think I kind of conjured him up in my mind as a representative figure of all these people that I had been reading about. His job before getting involved in hydropower was building bridges. We don't really think about this nowadays, but it was in the 1880s and 1890s that America was covered with bridges because of the railroads. So wherever there's a railroad, you need a railroad bridge. And when you start reading about the building of these bridges and the people who did it, it's just astonishing. And I wanted to show that kind of energy here in Buffalo, that kind of innovation. Yes?
His anger towards the city and his behavior, was that a blend of fact and fiction, or is that really?
Okay, the question has to do with Grover Cleveland and my portrayal of Grover Cleveland in the novel. I read a lot about Grover Cleveland in my research. In fact, I would say I read everything I could get my hands on about Grover Cleveland. And so when I portrayed him in the book, I portrayed him as accurately as I possibly could. So this was a man that when he was governor of the state of New York, he would return to Buffalo on the weekends and regularly get involved in fistfights in front of the bars of the city with journalists. He would pick fights with journalists, fistfights on the street. He was the governor then. There is this story about his relationship with a woman named Maria Halpin, that he got her pregnant Apparently, she had affairs with many men in Buffalo. There's some debate about whether she might actually have been a prostitute or just a kept woman. At any rate, she had a child. He had that child forcibly removed from her and actually imprisoned her in an asylum until she agreed to give that child up for adoption. This is not fiction, this is truth. And the more I read about him, and there were always rumors about him, and that, even when he married that young woman, there were rumors that he beat her and abused her. The rumors were so prevalent that at one point, when she was First Lady of the United States, she had to come forward and say, it's not true, he doesn't beat me. And that line where there's smoke, there's fire. So I don't know what their relationship really was, but these things were talked about with them. And we do know the story of the illegitimate child. We do know about the numerous cases of fistfights on the street when he was governor. And it just sparked my imagination. Now, the scene of him with Louisa Barrett. Louisa Barrett is a fictional character, so of course that did not really happen. What I was trying to show in that scene is really the abuse of power, and how at that time men considered themselves, particularly men who held positions of power and men of wealth, that women were property and that they could treat women however they pleased. So it was very true to the time. And I was writing that part of the book when all the revelations about Monica Lewinsky were coming out. The more things change, the more they remain the same. So I really feel that everything I say about Grover Cleveland is based on things that either actually happened or easily could have happened. Anything else? Any other questions?
But again on Cleveland, since he was the only Democratic president between Lincoln and Wilson, is it possible, since you read all of it, a little bit exaggerated by, again, the other party, just basically get him out of there?
Was it all politics? I don't know. I've been a lifelong Democrat. So politically, I was more sympathetic towards him than not. Whether it was all rumors, I don't know. He never denied the story about the illegitimate child. He told his supporters not to deny it, that it was true. So I don't think it was all political posturing. Maybe some of it. There was a little jingle that used to sing, "Mama, where's my pa, gone to the White House, ha, So, okay, that was political posturing, but it was based on something that was true. Yes?
Have you had any response from the descendants of some of the historical figures from Buffalo who are portrayed less than favorably in your
Okay,
book?
the question is if I'd had a response from the families here in Buffalo. This is a complicated issue. No, it is. First of all, I have to say that Grover Cleveland's son went on C-SPAN to condemn the novel when it came out. To think that Grover Cleveland's son was still alive and to take the time to go on C-SPAN to condemn my book, it was so flattering. Now, about the local families. I don't think they're portrayed in a bad way. I really don't. I think that I show them as great philanthropists, that everything they did, even everything Dexter Rumsey may have done towards Louisa Barrett, he did it to support the city, to make this city great. I felt great sympathy for the city fathers. Now, not all their descendants interpreted it the same way. And curiously, I was doing a book signing outside New York, and a granddaughter of one of the characters in the book came up to me, and I feel I shouldn't tell you, that I should keep that secret, but it was one of the very prominent families. And the granddaughter came up to me, she was wonderful, and she said, "Oh, you know, I'm so-and-so, and my family's in your book." And I thought something terrible was going to happen. And she said, "I have to tell you that all the descendants who left Buffalo think that your portrait of our family is absolutely honest and correct. That is exactly what our family was and is like. All of our relatives who stayed in Buffalo think it's a horrible scandal." And that happened again about one of the other families too. So I felt that's very interesting. I will also say that when the novel first came out, I was invited to the Garrett Club to speak, and a lot of the families belonged to the Garrett Club. The women belonged there. And so all the families were there that night, and they were wonderful to me. They brought me flowers. Descendant of the Urban family brought me green roses. They were famous in 1901 for cultivating green roses, and apparently they still have green roses at their estate outside Buffalo. They brought roses for me. They were wonderful people. So I think it's all been very good-natured, and I think the families have been more flattered than anything else. And I do regret if they think it was that some of the examples of what their families did might be less than 100% complimentary, but as I say, to me, overall, their contributions to this city were so extraordinary, and I was trying to pay tribute to them for their great philanthropy, their farsightedness. Yes?
Will there be a City of Light 2 or a movie?
The question is about a possible City of Light 2 or a movie. Now, the movie rights have been optioned several times, which was great, but as many of you probably know, just getting optioned is not enough, so a movie has never been made, but who knows, there's still hope. I think it would be very expensive because of the historical settings and the power station and everything. But I would love for a movie to be made. As to a City of Light 2, I don't think I would continue with the lives of these characters, but I don't rule out doing another novel based in Buffalo at some point in its history, but with a different set of characters. Yes?
Follow what you're saying is, if you ever think about it, is to do spin on the influence. How dare you? Because I'm sitting here coming from an immigrant family and thinking back on my, family Buffalo, because we were not that wealthy to do as the characters in your book. What were they thinking? What were they looking? Where were they working? Where were they from? I don't know.
I think issues been raised about somehow trying to find a way to portray the immigrant story, because the story of City of Light is so focused on the upper classes and on the power structure of Buffalo. Buffalo was a city of immigrants, and these people became wealthy off the labor of immigrants who were very poorly paid, no unions, constantly exploited. There is a real book there. I don't know if I'm the person to write that story, but if any of you are thinking of writing a novel, it would be a great topic. It's a great story. And an inspiring story, too, about what America is. People come here with nothing. They fight such hard battles. And then their families, become middle-class American families and partake in all that this country has to offer, and that seldom happens in Europe. So it really shows how fantastic this nation is. Yes?
Hi. A.R. Gurney. Some of us who grew up with it, he used to wash my face with snow, has written many plays and at least one novel about Buffalo. Did he influence you at all?
The question is about A.R. Gurney, and his wife is a SEM graduate. And of course I've met them in New York, and he's such a wonderful, warm man. I actually used to attempt to walk my dog in Central Park with A.R. Gurney and his dog, until my dog decided he hated A.R. Gurney's dog. And it was horrible dog fighting. And then we had to cross the street when we would see each other. So that was the end of my walking dogs with A.R. Gurney. But, you know, I love his work. I can't say he truly influenced what I was trying to do, but he helped me to conjure up the tone of the city. I find I use that word conjure up a lot because I often feel in writing fiction that there's something kind of tactile. You know, you go from nothing and you get these little sparks in your mind and kind of weave them into something bigger, something ever bigger. So that's what I mean by that word, conjuring something up. Yes?
Speaking of immigrants, reminded me of Mariah Loves quickly correcting someone who pronounced her name in Italian. And I'm wondering, was that an actual fact? And if so, where did you dig up such small details as that?
Okay, the question is about how I knew to call Mariah Love Mariah instead of Maria, the Italian way of pronouncing it. There's actually a lot of information available on all these people that I would gather up little clues here and there. So, you know, there was a book written about Mariah Love and her charities that had a photo of her in her sled. And it said, here she is with her sled driver. Well, that's the guy that I actually had being her chauffeur. So you can get all these incredible details. Now, about the Maria versus Mariah, that was in other reading. I don't know that, confess, I don't know that specifically said about her, but I do know in all the reading that I did, all the Henry James novels and Edith Wharton novels and all the books I read about upper class life in 1901, I knew that Mariah was the upper class way. These people did not use the Italian immigrant version. Maria, which was also Catholic, and these people were Protestant. Mariah is a Protestant name, not a Catholic name. It's all very complicated and interesting. To me, at least. The English pronunciation. The Anglo-Saxon pronunciation. Yes, in the back.
This has nothing to do with your book, but I have one comment to make for you about the buffalo in the terminals, central terminal. They are recreating it out of the original mold, and there is a buffalo there for you now. As a matter of fact,
oh, that's great. If you didn't hear, they have returned the bison to the central terminal. So we should all go over and see it. I remember being so awestruck when I was a little girl, walking into that building and this bison towering over me. I can't be the only person here who remembers that. I see a few of you notice that very important Buffalo landmark. Yes?
Warren, I have to ask, I've heard that one of the characters, the fictional characters you picked, one of the names just out of the blue, turned out in actuality to be someone that actually had lived in Buffalo.
You're referring to Austin Fox? Or?
Yes.
No, not Austin Fox. Hoyt, Austin Hoyt. This is a very funny story. This was asked by Amy, who was a classmate of mine here at SEM. I had a scene at the asylum, as you know, and I made a man named Austin Hoyt the superintendent, I guess was the proper term, of the asylum. He is not a very sympathetic character. Louisa has a very bad experience with him. Well, come to find out that he is a very prominent person for Buffalo, a film producer for WGBH in Boston, and the brother of the very Hoyt, after whom Hoyt Lake is named. So my first appearance in Buffalo, his sister-in-law came up to me and said, "Why did you name the director of the insane asylum after my brother-in-law?" And I had no idea who she was talking about. But the wonderful thing that came of that is that, you know, we exchanged email addresses, and now I'm friends with Austin Hoyt, the superintendent of that insane asylum. So I see good things come from his mistakes. And he thought it was very funny, so he took it in a good spirit. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, I'm sure you don't need any of us to suggest your next novel, but I had another idea that I might just throw out.
1901 and the story of the Pan American Exposition. I chose it in part because a novel needs an arc, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the framework of the Pan Am was a very convenient arc for me to take on. But I know in retrospect, I mean convenient in a practical sense, in a technical sense, for the requirements of writing a novel. There are so many novels that could be written in this city. At every period of the city's history, there's so much here. And I think about this all the time, of novels that could be written here. And again, I encourage all of you, you live here, most of you, some are visiting, even those of you who are visiting. This city is so rich. You know, there have been dozens and hundreds of novels written about New York City. Well, this city has as much material as New York City. So you need to get to work, all of you. And me too, it's very time-consuming to write a novel. You know, City of Light took 6 years. The Fierce Radiance took 8 years. Because you don't just write these in a void. Real life is going on while you're writing the novel. Takes a long time. So I think if we all get to work, then some more novels about Buffalo will get written. Yes?
When I read your novel, I came to the Coatsworth Mansion scene. For me, it was like deja vu all over again. It seemed to me I had been there before, but I can't imagine why I ever would have been. Then a few weeks later, it came to me. I was given a tour in 1966 by my world history professor in high school, who in fact owned the mansion at that time. And since he was my favorite teacher of all time, that sort of triggered a very positive memory in me, and I thank you for that.
You are so lucky. This gentleman says that in the 1960s, he actually was led on a tour of the Coatsworth house by the man who owned the property. Now, I have only been on the top floor. I've never been able to gain entry to the rest of the house. I would love to see the rest of it. I'm sure that was extraordinary. You are very lucky. I've heard all kinds of rumors about what goes on there nowadays, that it might have been a bed and breakfast for a while. I don't really...
It was a Carmelite convent from like 20 to 25.
It was a Carmelite convent? I didn't know that. What a spooky convent that was. Now there's a novel. I wonder what really went on there. Other questions? Yes?
I don't know, this might be a personal question. I just wonder what your occupation was now. I mean, is that your occupation?
Yeah, the question is, what is my occupation? And I'm very lucky that I can work as a full-time writer now. It's very unusual, and I know how lucky I am. Before City of Light was published, I worked a lot of odd jobs. I worked at an art gallery. I worked in television, documentary film production. Actually, that's what I did for many, many years. I was at CBS News for 10 years. And then I worked freelance on different documentary film productions. I worked as a fact checker at magazines. I worked doing abridgments of audiobooks. I did that at home while my son was little. Because I always had in my mind that I wanted to be a writer. And I always was doing that on the side.
You said you lived in Atlanta?
No, I never lived in Atlanta. I went to college at Swarthmore outside Philadelphia. And after that, I moved to New York. I had family in New York, and I basically lived in New York ever since leaving Buffalo.
So you have devoted most of your time to this book that just came out.
Yeah, Fierce Radiance, which came out in 2010, was my second novel. And if you haven't read that, that takes place in New York City, in Greenwich Village, which is where I live, during the Second World War. And it's a story about the struggles of the home front during the war, and it focuses on the development of antibiotics. You know, I like to write about how technology changes everyday lives. So in City of Light, I wrote about the coming of electricity. I mean, that's just one element of a very wide canvas. And in A Fierce Radiance, the coming of antibiotics and how that transformed all our lives. is one element in the lives of the people, as I say, living in the city during the Second World War, trying to make their way, preserve their families under the pressures of the war. Yes?
Are you working on another novel now?
The question is whether I'm working on another novel, and I am, but I'm very superstitious, so I don't ever talk about a work in progress. But I appreciate you asking. Anything else? The balcony? It's hard for me to see up there. Okay, I guess that's it. Well, thank you all very much.